Thank you very much. So I'm not going to take very much time, but I'd like to build a lot on a number of things I've heard, most immediately on David's comments about building communities and David Chan's remarks about effectively engaging people, which is basically the core of what I'll be saying today. So the first message is it's not enough to have a good idea. You have to know how to move the furniture around. Now, we've talked a lot about good ideas, but I'm concerned, I'd like to put out as sort of this closing, is to think about what does it take to effectively develop and implement policies towards, in general, but in particular towards smart cities, smart nations. So how do we build upon these good ideas, and what should the next steps be? And specifically for Singapore, how can we advance a smart nation idea, and how, in particular, the Center for Innovative Cities can foster, stimulate, support this project? Those are the questions I'd like to suggest as a possibility. Now, we can frame this issue as a general issue of public policy formation. That is, how does this happen? And I want to suggest to you that having a policy for it is not just enough to have the words, we want to do this, but if it's going to be effective policy, you have to be able to implement it. So what I'm asking you to think about a bit is how should we best define what the policy is, enact it, like give it this legal kind of framework, how should we implement it, and then more importantly, or importantly at least, is that how should we sustain it as a public policy? It's often easy to start things. It's the theme of the moment, it's got a big push, and so on. We set up special groups to do with it, but then what happens 5, 10 years later on? Is there a sustainable activity there? And if we want it to be, how will we ensure it? And then more particularly, we have here a policy for big data, which is an issue in technology policy. That is, it's different in some ways than policies for other activities of the public sphere, because the progress in the area requires the active participation of technical experts. That is, if you really want to get this job done, you have to have people who understand the data, can mash it together, can analyze it. You need those kinds of capabilities. And the issue is, and I'm speaking as an engineer, a lifetime engineer, is that typically these people are not particularly versed in policy. They're not really prepared to think about the legal aspects. That's not their thing. They're very good at computer science or data management or whatever. They don't understand the economics. They're not particularly sensitive maybe to the social dimensions and other things. So a key element of the community that has to implement a technology policy is often not really with the program, and they have to be brought into it. So part of the question is, how do we integrate the technology properly into this kind of activity? It's not going to happen by itself. So what are some of the criteria I would suggest to you for an effective policy? So on the one hand, I'm going to suggest that it should be competitive. That is, yes, we can do it this way, but is it the best way to do it? Is it a competitive way to do it? So you could have various images of a weather prediction. I saw a report on one particular big data effort, and it was so good, and the tagline at the end of the film was, now we can see how the surf comes up, and it's so much nicer to be able to get it from the web. Well, a web camera could have done that too. You didn't need a big data policy to see what the surf was like. So it needs to be competitive. It needs to meet the various needs and aspirations of a range of stakeholders. And in particular, I emphasize this idea of a sufficient block of interest groups. That is, people will benefit from big data or something of the sort, not all for the same reason. You need to have a community of interest, and they will have different aspirations, different needs, and will find satisfaction or not find satisfaction in it for a variety of reasons. So we should think about how do we assemble a sufficient constituency for it. And it's not just the number of people, it is that they have interest, they are willing to work on it to make it happen. So I want to emphasize that the needs of the interest groups to which we have to appeal to actually roll this out and make it happen to sustain it are very different. Their financial interests, their political interests, their social interests, and what is a sufficient block is not going to be ever well defined, but you need to have enough to make it move ahead and to sustain it. And finding out and defining that sufficient group, I think, is part of how do we think our way through going from the big idea to what actually will implement it. So let's think about some of these issues. We can talk about defining the public policy, and a key element is to have a vision for it. But a vision it may often not be enough at all to do it. It can be a mirage. Yes, we will have a smart whatever. Will this really work? So I think one needs to, in this process of defining it, think carefully about the possibilities and constraints, political, financial, social, technical. One has to put together what we sometimes call in the United States a game plan. How do we make this happen? And we also have to self-edit. That is, it's not just if we can do it, what are the competitive alternatives? How should the data be centralized or should it be distributed? Should it be public or private? One of the interesting things that I draw upon David's past presentation was exactly that there was such a wide variety of people participating in Smart London, it all wasn't the government doing it. So that many perspectives are useful in doing this. So going from defining it, one wants to think, now how do we enact it? How do we go from the concept to some kind of explicit statement of where we're going? And in this particular context, I think we need to recognize that the political, legal, budget issues are likely to dominate. That is, Steve Adler was, for example, mentioning that he had a great idea for how it's going to happen, and then legal said, oh, wait a second, you can't do that. This is the kind of thing that often happens, but if you're part of effectively developing a policy is to anticipate and to think through in advance as much as you can about these kinds of issues, it seems to me. So how does this policy fit into existing commitments? Whose budgets will be supporting it? And we're talking now about a completely or strongly different set of stakeholders than when you're thinking about what's the big idea, how can we do it? So part of what I'm suggesting is there's a dynamic that goes through where the stakeholders change over time as to who's dominated and who may be more important, has to be paid attention to. Then, and this is, I think, particularly important at this stage, we go from the implementation, that is, from the high-level leadership to the people who are actually going to do it on their job. And these is a new cast of participants who they're required to make things happen, to put the data together, to release it, to get the various permissions and so forth. Often they've not been involved in the high-level formulation of the policy. So the history of Obamacare in the United States is there's one whole difficulty of enacting the law, but then the implementation of it has been a management and implementation nightmare. We could say it's successful, but it has certainly been very, very difficult. We have to deal with people who have new job requirements, new procedures. They lack understanding maybe of why they're doing it, what the authority is. They have unfunded obligations. One of the issues about the implementation of Obamacare is that doctors' offices in the United States are now having to put in a lot of money into computer systems that they didn't have to do before, but that's not paid for explicitly, so you have unfunded obligations, and you encounter a lot of passive-aggressive resistance, exactly what the minister said right at the beginning of saying the PM is asking people to have open data, and I'm sure they're saying, yes, Prime Minister, yes, Minister, but the story the minister was saying, it isn't happening very, very quickly. There is resistance. This is a normal kind of thing. So it's needed a lot of attentive management. Finally, we want to think about not just starting it off, we need to sustain it. That is, at some point it'll go from an exciting headline initiative to yesterday's news and some kind of routine. How do we now justify the continuation of it in face of the changing conditions? There'll be new priorities, so there'll be limited funding, that's not what you had at the beginning. There'll be technical advances, there'll be obsolescence. And what is ultimately the benefit cost? What is the value for money? And as people have been saying, this is not very well defined. So this kind of issue merits consideration from the start. That is, what is the game plan of going from idea to plan to implementation to sustainability? So the takeaways I'd like to suggest is the practical importance of identifying stakeholders and their interests right from the beginning. That we need to sort of effectively engage people into it. We need to do it, part of our thinking is we need to do it right from the start and continue it. We need to think carefully about what the powers of these stakeholders are. They may not be legal powers, but if you are trying to get something done, people can resist it. So that is a power in themselves, or they can appeal to different regulations or rules, so that we need to have an appreciation of the interest and the evolution of the interest over time. So for big data, also the stakeholders include the technological experts from the start also, among the other economic, financial, and social participants in the process. So where do we go from here? How can the Center for Innovative Cities in particular, the technological community in Singapore, foster, stimulate, and support big data? That's the idea I'd like to leave with you. And my suggestion really is that the universities, and SUD in particular, which is well represented here, can provide in some ways a neutral ground for convening conversations between the stakeholders. My thought is that notion of convening discussions and maintaining the discussions between the stakeholders is going to be a continuing important activity. And through various activities that they can have, seminars, theses, etc., that they can help provide the continuation of the discussion that are, what I claim will be important towards effective implementation. And in some ways what I'm calling for is the establishment of something that you might call a technology policy forum within the context of the academia in Singapore to help think about and continue this exercise so that we can go from this high-level discussion to thinking about how do we continue the discussion, how do we build upon it, how do we sort through more detailed issues as we go through the process. That's my thought for today. Thank you very much.